confess with me? I am a child of God. I'm saved by grace. I live each day by faith, and I'm ready to hear God's word. Please stand for the reading of the word, and this is short and sweet, but I want you to think soberly about these words. James says, now remember, when you're being tempted, don't say, God is tempting me. God is never tempted to do wrong, and he never tempts anyone else. Temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions, and when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. And God bless this reading, as people said. Amen. I want to go back to our study of David a little bit. I want to talk about something that really touches everybody's life, and that is what I call chaos on the home front. Now, I'm sure none of you ever go through any of that. Chaos on the home front, no problems. All of us live in perfect families where everything falls out the way it should, everything happens the way it's supposed to, everybody behaves righteously, no mistakes are made, and we never have any problems with our kids, right? Isn't it great? I met a guy like that one time. He was in a psychiatric facility on heavy medication. Let me share a couple of thoughts with you as we open our lesson this morning. We're going to look at the life of David. I'm going to be honest with you. We're going to cover 6 chapters in machine gun style. I'm just going to give you some examples of things that come off the tracks in David's life. We always think of David as being wonderful and virtuous and righteous and godly and all of that. Listen, his home life was a train wreck. It was an absolute train wreck from beginning to end. And I'll tell you why. Because he was a lousy parent. He was a standoff, hands-off, I'm not going to engage parent. When his kids got out of line, he just kind of shook his head and got mad but never said anything. He did not discipline them. He did not structure them. And obviously, he didn't model a very good life for them because they grew up to be just like him. And therein lies the story. Every family goes through its share of troubles. I don't need to tell you that. We all go through them. Many of us, I'm sure right now, right here in this room, are going through hardships and problems, whatever they may be. You know, you can make a list as long as both our arms, can't you? I give you a list of mine. Wouldn't do any good. You just say, well, I've had some of those and 6 others as well. We all go through stuff. Sometimes we have good times and things are going great. Other times, you know, one wheel comes off, 2 wheels come off. Sometimes you feel like all 4 wheels are off and you're trying to drag the wagon down the road and the wagon doesn't even work. That's just life. And it's something that God understands. God doesn't candy coat his characters in the Bible. Yes, David's a psalmist. Yes, David had great bravery against Goliath. Yes, David was virtuous in his dealings with Saul. David did a lot of good things, but God doesn't hesitate to tell you, but David had his problems at home. And by the way, David's not the only one. I could mention names like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. His kids gave him fits, and just go on down the list. You know, you name them, they're there. How we handle those situations. And sometimes I'm talking about preemptive strikes. Sometimes we're talking about there are things that need to be headed off before they ever get started. The easiest way to correct a problem is to prevent it in the first place. It's a lot easier to correct it up front by doing the right things and setting the right patterns than it is to let the thing blow up in your face and then scramble around to try to glue the pieces back together. You know, the best thing to do with Humpty Dumpty is to find him a seatbelt to keep him on the wall. It's a lot better than calling in all the king's horses and all the king's men to try to put him together again. And yet sometimes, even as Christians, we don't, for some reason, that doesn't register with us. And we feel like, as young parents, for instance, we can be lackadaisical and we can be lazy and we can be careless with our faith while we're young. And our kids will understand. I mean, I take them to church all the time, but we're not involved. We don't model. We don't really give them the kind of example and modeling they should have. And then later on, when they lose interest and drop out, and we try to figure out why, when if you go back and look at what was laid as a foundation to begin with, are you really surprised? And a lot of us, even in our own lives, can have experienced that, haven't we? A lot of us grew up in homes where Christ wasn't modeled very well, and where goodness wasn't a virtue and wasn't cherished and wasn't promoted and wasn't enforced. And if we found Christ in the due process beyond that, it's because we've had to come out the hard way and learn. I'd like to talk with you a little bit about just family troubles. Let me give you a little back. There's two kinds of family problems that we all deal with. We all deal with all of them. So don't feel like I'm picking on one person or another. We all have both of these categories. The first kind of trouble that comes to a family is external. External things happen. A storm damages your house. You have to borrow money to fix it. That puts you in a financial hole. And then all the ripple effects that come out of that. Or a business fails. Or, disease strikes somebody in the family without any way of knowing. Nothing you did, you just got sick. Or, God forbid, even this happens. Sometimes death comes knocking unexpectedly. What's that all about? I don't get it. That's external. Those are external things. And the reason I say that's because they're beyond your control. Those kind of things you can't, if I get cancer, I get cancer. I didn't go out and, I didn't book a vacation trip to Chernobyl so that I could walk around in the nuclear site and get infected and develop cancer. That it wasn't a planned thing. Now, can we do things that can cause cancers in our body? Sure. And we know that. That's between you and your body, how you handle that. But a lot of times things like that happen. You don't have any control over. Tornadoes don't call ahead and say, are you going to be home today at 3? You go out, you come back, and there's no house left, or a big chunk of your house is gone. You don't have any control over that. And a lot of times those kind of family crises bring us together, don't they? I mean, how many times have we seen in the aftermath of a natural disaster, you see communities and individuals pulling together. And what do you hear them say? At least we're all safe. Now, the subtitle to that is, so that we can pull together and help each other put the pieces back together. That's the idea, is that we draw to each other in times of crisis. Somebody gets sick, the family rallies. If there's a disaster, our family and friends, we come together. External crises are still crises, and they're hard to deal with, but generally they become a useful rallying point. Now, internal causes are a different animal. Internal causes are entirely different. Internal has more to do with emotional and moral kinds of things. For instance, alcoholism tends to be multi-generational. Domestic violence tends to be multi-generational. Believe it or not, sexual predators tend to be multi-generational. What do I mean by multi-generational? I mean, Grandpa was that way, Dad's that way, Junior's that way, and chances are pretty good that little Bubba's going to be that way. Because some things get modeled and taught in a family. And that's why I suggest that internal causes are mostly self-inflicted. If I don't bother to engage with my children and parent them as I should, I am going to self-inflict certain troubles on myself later on. The chickens are going to come home to roost. If I'm abusive to my wife or to my children, that's going to come back. On me or on somebody else, it's going to tend to perpetuate itself. If I'm an alcoholic or a drug addict, that will tend to become a multi-generational problem. Because when Junior gets in trouble and has a lot of stress, what's he going to do? He's going to de-stress the same way Daddy does. And if Daddy came home every night and drunk himself underneath the table, then guess what? Bubba's that's the first place he's going to turn. Why? Because it's something he's familiar with. And believe it or not, even though he hasn't done it before himself, he knows how to deal with it because he's been around it all his life. He's comfortable with it because he's been around it. And if it leads to abuse, well, that's okay. He's seen that too, and he knows how that works. He knows about all the excuses because he's heard Dad make them. And I say dad, I'm picking on dads a lot. Moms are the same way. Moms can be the same way in both positives and negatives. Do you get what I'm saying? Internal things tend to be self-inflicted. And they're much more damaging long-term, and they're much harder to deal with. When my house is destroyed, I can rebuild a house and replace my stuff. When I destroy my child's life through abuse, sometimes that can be almost an irreparable situation. And a lot of us, again, have experienced some of those things, and you know how hard it is to overcome what we call dysfunction within a family. And by the way, those kind of internal problems is what tears family apart. It will absolutely implode your family. And so what do? Well, that's where the preemptive strike comes in, isn't it? You don't go there. And you don't set. Listen, I'm going to tell you something. And most of us who are parents and grandparents know this all too well. Our kids have got enough garbage in this life to deal with. They're going to get enough bad influence in their lives regardless of what we do. Well, I'm going to homeschool my kids. Good luck. They still live in a world full of social media, television, radio, music, social, all this stuff going on around them, and you can't escape it. It's just everywhere. I think one reason we as Christian parents get frustrated sometimes is because even when we're trying our hardest, we lose the battle. Because the world around us. Studies have shown again and again, teenagers don't listen to parents, they listen to their friends. And it's like I've said, kids, I love you guys, but I've always told you, don't get advice from your friends. They're as stupid as you are. And I might say that to parents sometimes because that may be true. So you get into this complex, and it's hard enough. It's hard enough to raise decent people anymore, much less Christian children anymore. With all of that going on, we need to stack everything we can in our favor at home and hope that can somehow shield them from some of this other stuff. I want you to look at a couple of passages where God gives you something to think about. There's a book that's written, I just ordered a copy of it. It's called something about In This World or something like that. It's on the principle of what's called the harvest principle. And it's true, isn't it? Don't be misled. You can't mock the justice of God. Now, they're not talking about divine judgment. They're talking about the way God has designed life. That's the justice of God. What goes around comes around. He says you'll always harvest what you plant. Those who live only to satisfy their own sinful nature will harvest decay and death from that sinful nature. Look at the word decay. That's where the wheels start coming off the wagon. Those who live to please the Spirit will harvest everlasting life from the Spirit. Listen to these words out of the mouth of Job. This is profound. My experience, see if you would agree with this. My experience shows that those who plant trouble and cultivate evil will harvest the same. Huh? Now, don't apply that to your people at work that you don't like. Apply it to yourself as a parent. If you sow evil and you sow corruption and you sow godlessness or you sow apathy or you sow inconsistency, what are you going to reap? There is a locked-in principle here. God says what goes around comes around. What you sow is what you will reap. Now, anybody that farms knows that. Anybody that gardens knows that. We know that in the realm of farming and gardening, and yet we don't get it in life, and yet it's true. So be careful what you sow. Now, let me give you a quick, fasten your seatbelts. We're going to take off and fly high speed. This is going to be a supersonic flight. I'm going to let you read a little bit of the stories, but not give you a lot of summary of them, okay? David's life. Remember the sin with Bathsheba? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that little encounter on the rooftop. Yeah, which went south real fast. And then he covered up one sin with another one, and then he covered it with another one, and then he lied about that. And then he sat around for 2 years or for a year and thought everything was going good until God kind of showed him out with the prophet Nathan. And then David said, I have sinned. And what's the first thing Nathan says? Nathan, the first thing he says after David says, I have sinned is, God forgives you. So is David forgiven? Can David go to heaven? Yes. Does David then, is he free of the consequences? You know, if you get drunk and fall down and break your arm, okay? If you get drunk and fall down and break your arm, you can be forgiven of the drunkenness, but you're still going to have a broken arm for 6 weeks. And it's going to throb and ache and hurt and be awkward to deal with. And when you take the cast off, it's going to be atrophied and you'll have to recondition it and all of that. Sorry. You just have to deal with the consequences. If you're driving drunk and you hit another car and you kill that family, can you be forgiven of that? Well, sure, God will forgive you of that. I mean, don't be frivolous about it, but God can forgive that and will. And you can go to heaven. But before you get to heaven, you may have to do a little time in a big house. Because the state is still going to take their pound of flesh. They're going to come back and say, listen, you killed 2 people, and we consider that a form of homicide. And when you commit a homicide, you serve 10 years in prison. Now, you can be faithful to God, you can get religion and all of that, you're still going to serve you 10 years. 8 with good behavior. So we understand. We don't like to hear it. We don't like to think about it. But sin has 2 things involved. One guy described the grace of God as our bar of soap. And with the grace of God, we can wash ourselves clean. We can get rid of the consequences of the sin eternally and the guilt of sin. But you can't get rid of the earthly consequences because sometimes they just inevitably are going to follow. And so that's something we got to think about. I want you to watch what happens in David's life. And by the way, God told him this is going to happen because God knows where this thing's headed. God says to David, this is what the Lord says, because of what you have done, I will cause your household to rebel against you. That is internal conflict. That's the self-inflicted. And it starts with the choice that David makes to compromise his morals, to not do his job as king, to not be where he's supposed to be, to not be doing what he's supposed to be doing, and instead to pursue the satisfaction of his own lusts and desires, and then to cover it up to try to make it sound better than it is, to avoid responsibility. Okay, this is a bad pattern to set. And evidently it's not the only time this happens. Watch what happens. Number 1, they lose an infant son to death, don't they? In fact, it was the son that they conceived in the course of the sin. Notice what it says in 2 Samuel 15. Nathan returned to his home. This is after confronting David. And it goes on to say, the Lord sent a deadly illness to the child of David and Uriah's wife. Notice she's not even named. She's called Uriah's wife. You know what the statement is there? You hear the judgment in that statement? David and another man's wife. So this is a judgment, isn't it? David begged God to spare the child. He went without food, lay all night on the bare ground. The elders of his household pleaded with him to get up and eat with him, but he refused. And then on the 7th day, the child died. Now there's more to that story, but I want you to see a consequence of that sin. God was not going to honor their sin by allowing them to have this child. Now somebody says, well, that's cruel on God's part. Well, remember, God's God and you're not. And he has the right to make choices like this. Now, did they have other children? Yes. In fact, David and Bathsheba parented the man who would later become king, Solomon. So other things happened that were good, but this first child, no, it's not going to happen. And so that's the first thing that happens. Now, you would think, okay, well, I get that. Let's move on with our lives. And so he moves on, and guess what happens? One of his sons, now, this is another problem you get into. He has a son rape his own half-sister. And somebody says, well, I don't want to hear about that. Well, guess what? It's fact of life. Fact of life. And again, what did God tell the king never to do? Don't take multiple wives, right? One of the first things God says to the king, don't take multiple wives. They introduce idolatry, and in God's wisdom, God knows, and you're going to create a lot of compromise. You got 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 wives. Each one of them have kids. You got all these hot-blooded boys running around, and you knew what was going to happen. They're all living together in the palace, and you got this hot-blooded young man, Amnon, and his half-sister Tamar, who is stunningly beautiful. By the way, she has a brother named Absalom. Absalom's wild hair all of his own. But Absalom's sister Tamar is, and the Bible's very plain about this, she is one good-looking girl. And Amnon is one hot-blooded young man. And Amnon gets the sweets for her. He really likes her. He wants her. Now, why not? It was okay for Dad, right? It's okay for Dad to get him a woman he wanted. In fact, Dad's got a whole room full of women he wants. I just want one. It's not like she's my real sister. So, can you just see his mind turning? Amnon lay down and pretended to be sick. When the king came to see him. Now, this is David. David comes in. Amnon's pretending to be sick. David comes in, says, what can I do to help you? And he says, please let my sister Tamar come and cook my favorite dish as I watch. You don't have to have a degree in psychology to know what's going on here. Did it not occur to David? Why does he need Tamar to fix his dish? Every cook in the palace knows his favorite dish. One reason it's his favorite dish is because it gets served a lot. He likes it. Everybody knows how to make. Why does he need her to cook it? So he can watch. What's he going to watch? Her culinary technique? This is such a contrived situation that it should be obvious. But David's too busy. He doesn't want to get involved in all this inner dynamic stuff. He's got bigger things to do. So the story picks up. When she finally came, she set the serving tray before him. He refused to eat. And then he says, everyone get out of here, he told his servants. So they all left. Now we got Hungry Jack here with his stepsister in an empty room. Bad goes to worse, right? Then he says to Tamar, now bring the food into my bedroom. Oh, yeah. I mean, dinner in bed, might as well. And feed it to me here. So Tamar took it. She's kind of, I want to say innocent, not innocent in the sense of maybe not complicit, but she's kind of naive here, isn't she? I mean, at this point, it's time to get out of Dodge. This is not a good situation. Tamar took his favorite dish to him, but as she was feeding him, he grabbed her and demanded, come to bed with me, my darling sister. Tells you how he feels. No, my brother, don't be foolish. Don't do this to me. Such wicked things aren't done in Israel. Thank goodness, at least she said no. Where can I go in my shame? You'd be called one of the greatest fools in Israel. Please just speak to the king about it. I'm sure he'll let me marry you. If you want me that bad, let's get married. But Amnon wouldn't listen to her, and since he was stronger than she was, he raped her. Pure and simple. Now, let me tell you what happens to her. We're not going to follow this story. It destroys her life. She goes back home to her brother Absalom, confesses what's happened. She is so humiliated and so shamed that she becomes an old maid and a recluse, and she will never leave the house again. She stays in her brother's house for the rest of her life. So basically, Amnon wantonly destroyed. Oh, and by the way, you know what's interesting to me? I didn't finish the rest of the verse. It says he raped her, and after he got finished with her, he kicked her out of the room and hated her from then on. Isn't that so typical? He got what he wanted. Now he's not interested. And he could care less about what it did to her. She's just an afterthought. She was just a little fun time. Consequences. Well, this is going to have some devastating consequences, because the next thing that happens is Absalom kills him out of revenge. She comes in, spills her heart. Absalom, and evidently they were very close. Absalom is absolutely livid. He is outraged. But what's interesting is he doesn't grab a knife and run over next door. Watch what happens. And again, this shows you. You remember how Amnon kind of sleazed his way around and snuck his way around and set this whole thing up? Guess what? Absalom does the same thing to Amnon. He sets him up. Which tells you that there's a level of deceit and dishonesty within this family that's just rampant. I mean, they lie to each other. They deceive each other. They set each other up to take advantage of each other. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Notice this. When David heard what had happened, he was very angry. So somebody finally went back and told David, well, you know, this is what happened. Look what Amnon did. And David got real upset. What did he do about it? Nothing. Nothing. He did nothing. He got upset. Well, that upsets me. Well, who cares? Now, do you ever do that as a parent? Do you ever look at a kid and say, well, that really upsets me, and they just let them go right on and do what they want? What's the message? Well, I've upset Mom, but there's no consequences. Do whatever I want. Get away with it once, get away with it twice. Before you know it, it becomes a pattern of life. So, though Absalom never spoke to Amnon about it, he hated Amnon deeply because of what he'd done to his sister. I want you to look at that language. He hated his brother deeply. He hates him on a gut level, on a visceral level. Anytime he walks down the hall and he sees him in another room, his insides just churn. He despises this guy. Now, the only thing worse than anger is when you let it fester. You bury anger inside and let it just let it grow for a while. And it'll be just like a cancer. It'll consume you in time. 2 years later, when Absalom's sheep were being sheared at Baal Hazor near Ephraim, Absalom invited all the king's sons to come to a feast. That would include Amnon. Oh, I'm going to have a big dinner for everybody. Is that because he likes all his brothers? No. Is that because he's sociable? No. Hospitality? Not for a minute. He only wants one there. And by the way, going on, we'll skip part of the story. He makes sure that Amnon is coming. He sends messengers to make sure Amnon gets an invite. Says, listen, I know we've had some bad words and I'm mad at you, but listen, I want you to really come and be with the rest of the family. Well, family, get together. Absalom told his men, wait until Amnon gets drunk. By the way, that tells you something else, doesn't it? He party animal. Wait until he gets drunk, and then at my signal, kill him. And don't be afraid, because I'm giving the order. Take courage and do it. So at Absalom's signal, they murdered Amnon, and then the other sons of the king jumped on their mules and fled. For all they knew, Absalom was going to clean house. They weren't aware that this was not maybe a purge. But he got the one he wanted. And it was all based on a lie. And put up. What happens next? Well, guess what? Absalom, hey, get away with one thing. Get away with something else. Absalom gets banished. For 2 years, he gets banished from the kingdom. But then what does David do? Invites him back. So he rebels against his father, and he leads a political conspiracy. He actually leads a revolt against David that forces David to leave the capital. Absalom lived in Jerusalem for 2 years, but he never got... Now, here's another... Again, this hands-off parenting. He never got to see the king. How can you reconcile with a son that's been gone for years? How can you invite him back and never even talk to him for 2 years? Never try to heal that. Never try to repair that problem. Never try to teach anything. Doesn't see his dad for 2 years. And after this, Absalom bought a chariot and horses and hired 50 bodyguards to run ahead of him. Got up early in the morning, went to the gate of the city. When people brought a case to the king, Absalom would ask where in Israel they were from, and they'd tell him their tribe, and he'd say, you really got a strong case here. It's too bad the king doesn't have anyone to hear it. Isn't that interesting? It's too bad the king's too busy to listen to you. What's he doing? He's lying. Well, you're not going to get a fair judgment there. I'll tell you what, I wish everyone could bring their cases to me. I'd give them justice. I'd take care of them. You make me king, you'll get things taken care of. And he's picking people from all over the land. It goes on and says the people tried to bow before him. And, of course, he knows just how to play this like a con man, doesn't he? They come up to bow before him like, well, thank you so much. And he says, no, please don't bow down. And he'd take them by the hand, and he'd kiss them, and he did this with everyone who came to the kingdom. And look at the last statement, and he stole the hearts of all the people. He's a smooth-talking, slick-working con artist. And he's building his power base. He's getting popular support. And what he's doing is he's catching them in the gate just as they come into the city before they ever have a chance to get to the king. They don't really know if the king cares or not because they never see him. He's a pretty slick operator. Well, he leads a revolt eventually. Skipping down a few verses, a messenger arrived in Jerusalem to tell David, all Israel has joined Absalom in a conspiracy against you. And what's David's first reaction? What's he going to do? What should a king do? Fight! It's his kingdom. Doesn't belong to that little snot-nosed kid. Bring your mighty men together and put a whooping on him. Teach him a lesson. No. David says, well, I think we better run or it's going to be too late. Hurry, if we get out of the city before he comes, then everything will be fine. What's going on? So Absalom becomes the de facto king. Now, you want to get really nasty about it? Watch what happens next. Absalom, whose own sister was raped by his stepbrother, now decides to commit the ultimate act of incest within his own family. Watch this. Ahithophel, this is Absalom's advisor. You know, this is like having G. Gordon Liddy as your moral consultant on how to do things. Those of you that didn't live in the 60s don't know who G. Gordon Liddy is, but you know, it'd be like having Saddam Hussein as your advisor on how to take care of the people. Okay? He says, go and sleep with your father's concubines, for he's left them here to look after the palace, and then all Israel will know that you have insulted your father beyond hope, and they'll throw their support to you. Now listen to this. By the way, where did David see Bathsheba? He was standing on his roof, looking down on her roof. So look what they do. Now you talk about rubbing your face in it. This is his son now. They set up a tent on the palace roof where everyone could see it, and Absalom went in and had sex with his father's concubines. So he put on a Playboy Mansion show right here on the roof of the palace where everybody could see it. The most insulting, disgusting, immoral, nasty, it's just, you know, just as nasty as it could be. But the feeling was, this will prove that you're a real man. Yeah, well, it always has, hasn't it? And so, look what's going on. And so the last thing is, this rebel son, you know, he ends up dying. He ends up being murdered. Because when David finally gets the guts to take his army and put them on the field, they just whoop the stew out of this boy's army. He doesn't have any army. He doesn't know how to lead. And David is a military man. Well, as the army is whipping Absalom, he tells his commanders, all of them, he says, now listen, sooner or later you're going to catch up to Absalom. Now this is David's words, I want you to deal gently with him. In other words, don't kill him. I want you to bring him back to me. That was the order he gave. Now listen to this. They said to David, well, why don't you come with us to make sure? And David says, no, I need to stay in the capital. Again, hands off. I'm not getting involved. And so they go out and they eventually hunt Absalom down. During the battle, Absalom happened to come upon some of David's men, and he tried to escape on his mule, but he rode beneath the thick branches of a tree. This is the best argument I know of for not having long hair. And his hair got caught in the tree, and his mule kept going and left him dangling. So you got this guy hanging from a tree by his hair. A little embarrassing. Incredibly vulnerable. Okay? And one of the men saw and came back to Joab. Now, Joab is David's chief general, but Joab is David's fixer. I don't know of a better word to use. Joab takes care of problems. Who put Uriah in the front line of the battle? Joab. Who now has access to hanging Absalom? Joab. Joab fixes problems. Now, David loves Absalom, but Joab sees him for what he is. He's a threat. He's a threat to the administration. So what do you do with threats? You eliminate them. Enough of this nonsense, because he told his men, he says, well, go and kill him. And they said, oh, we're not killing him. You remember what the king said. He said, be nice to him. Bring him back. We're not going to go against that. Joab says, take a hike. I'll take care of it myself. And he took 3 daggers and plunged them into Absalom's heart as he dangled still alive in the great tree. And the intent of his young men, armor bearers, surrounded him and killed him. So they just used him as a piñata and worked him over until he was good and dead. So, what has gone right in all of this? If you're thinking nothing, you're right. And it all goes back to what God said. I will make your family turn on you. So I want you to end by considering this. Even those of us in this generation who are grandparents, who are parents, who will someday be parents, who have friends and circles of influence, listen to these words of Paul. Don't let sin control the way you live. Don't give in to sinful desires. Don't let any part of your body become an instrument of evil to serve sin. Instead, give yourselves completely to God, for you were dead, but now you have new life. So use your whole body as an instrument to do what is right for the glory of God. Why? Because what you sow is what you'll reap. I encourage you as parents and as grandparents to take that seriously. To take your spiritual commitments seriously. To let your loyalty to God lead your decision making. To raise our children and grandchildren in the nurture and admonition of God. Is it a guarantee? No. But does it get you a whole lot closer to where you need to be than where you'd be otherwise? Absolutely. Don't pull a David. Well, so-and-so did such and such. Well, deal with it. I don't have time. Really? Will you have time to go to his court hearing in 3 years? And pay his lawyer bills? And visit him in jail? It's the old commercial all over again. Pay me now or pay me later. How much does an oil filter cost? Somebody tell me. Help me out. What's an oil filter? Oh, come on. Somebody knows what an oil filter costs. About average. Let's say an oil filter costs you $10. What does an engine cost? Well, it depends on what kind of car you drive. I know if you're driving a Lamborghini, it's like $19,000. My pickup truck you could put a new engine in for probably $3.95, and I'm not talking about 100. I'm talking about $3.95. No, I mean an engine's going to cost you $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. Oil filter costs you $10. But what happens if you don't change the oil filter regularly? You're going to get to buy an engine. Well, that's kind of God's principle of the harvest. It's better to pay him a little bit along the way than to pay the big bill at the end. Something to think about. Anyway, that's the story of David's wagon that lost the wheels. I would hate to be in his situation. Now, I'm not trying to make anybody feel bad. I'm not trying to make any of us feel like failures. My family has their problems. Your family has theirs. Some of our problems have been externally generated and beyond our control. Some of them have been self-inflicted. I'm not just going to be honest with you. You know, I'm not a perfect parent. I'm not a perfect person. Neither is any of us. But you do the best you can. And you do what's right any chance you get. And you plant the seeds anytime you have a chance to plant them. And you model the right behavior every chance you get. Well, I can't make my kids go to church. You want to bet? You want to bet? Let them miss about 6 or 7 days of meals sitting in the backyard because they're out of the house, and they'll figure it out. They may not like to be there, but they'll be there. You do what you can because you got to let those kids know, hey, this is important. It matters. We've got to take care of this business. So, you know, think about that as we go through this, these warnings of letting your body be an instrument of righteousness. If you're not a Christian, boy, you need to become a Christian. That's just first step. That's not long-term, figure this all out down the road. That's right now. Because if you're not a Christian, you have no witness. What you're saying to those around you, to those generations that look at you, is the Lord's work doesn't matter at all. It has no priority. It has no importance. It doesn't mean a thing. That's the wrong message. You need to become a Christian. You need to come, put your faith in Jesus, give your life to Jesus, be baptized into Jesus. You need to do that this morning. We encourage you to do that. That's one reason we sing. If you're a Christian, man, don't feel guilty. Feel challenged. Let God lift you to a higher level. We all can do better. The question is, will we all do better? And I pray that this lesson will get us to thinking about that. Let's do that together and encourage while we stand and sing.